But I think everyone in this band and people who have been and gone, so to speak, have passed through Fleetwood Mac.
Mick Fleetwood turned 78 this year, and for the first time in decades, he is talking openly about the things he used to leave out of interviews. The affairs, the addiction that swallowed a fortune, the friendships that never fully recovered. For 50 years, Fleetwood Mac has been remembered as one of the greatest bands in rock history. But behind the platinum records was a group of people who loved each other, betrayed each other, and somehow kept making music anyway. This is the real story of how a shy, dyslexic boy from Cornwall became the heartbeat of that chaos, and why, even now, he is still trying to bring the people he hurt and the people who hurt him back into the same room. Mick Fleetwood was born on June 24, 1947, in the small Cornish town of Redruth. His father served as a wing commander in the Royal Air Force, and that single fact shaped almost everything about Mick's childhood. Military families rarely stay in one place for long, and the Fleetwoods were no exception. Before Mick had finished primary school, he had already lived on 3 continents, absorbed 3 different cultures, and learned that home was less a location than a feeling he carried with him. When Mick was around 4 years old, the family relocated to Egypt, where they would remain for roughly 6 years. Those years happened to coincide with major upheaval in the region, including the revolution of 1952 and the Suez Crisis a few years later. A child doesn't necessarily register political history, but he does register sound, and Egypt gave young Mick an entire universe of rhythm he never consciously studied but never forgot. The layered percussion of the streets, the call and response patterns of local music, the sense that a beat could carry emotion without a single lyric, all of it lodged itself somewhere in his memory, waiting to resurface years later behind a drum kit. From Egypt, the family was reassigned to Norway, where his father's NATO posting kept them for several more years. Mick, now around 10, was enrolled in local schools and became fluent in Norwegian, a language he would eventually forget almost entirely but which left a lasting mark on how quickly he could adapt to unfamiliar environments. The long, dark winters of Norway also gave him something less obvious, an unusual comfort with silence and space, the kind of internal quiet that later showed up in the way he built atmosphere with rhythm rather than melody. School itself was a different story entirely. Mick struggled with severe dyslexia at a time when almost nobody understood what that meant. Teachers assumed he wasn't trying or wasn't bright enough, when in reality he simply processed information differently than the tests around him demanded. He is described breaking down in tears as a child, praying to be released from an environment that made him feel stupid despite being neither stupid nor lazy. It's a familiar story now, one shared by countless kids with learning differences, but in post-war Britain there was no language for it, and no patience either. Everything changed when he turned 13 and his parents gave him a small drum kit. He taught himself to play by ear in the attic of the family home, hammering along to Everly Brothers records and early rock and roll singles with no formal instruction of any kind. Because he had never been taught the correct way to hold a beat, he developed something entirely his own, instinctive, physical, built more on feel than technique. What began as an escape from a school system that had failed him slowly turned into the only thing he was ever certain he was good at. Creativity ran in the family in less obvious ways too. His father wrote poetry and dabbled in drums for fun. One sister went on to become an actress, another explored sculpture. As a boy, Mick even built a makeshift nightclub inside a barn behind their house, complete with a stage and lighting he rigged himself, imagining a crowd that didn't exist yet. Decades later, when he opened a real restaurant and music venue on Front Street in Maui, he would trace the idea directly back to that barn. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a vision he had been chasing his entire life. At 15, miserable and failing academically, Mick dropped out of school. Rather than push back, his parents supported the decision, buying him a better drum kit and helping him move to London to chase a career in music. With no money for a car, he bought a used taxi and used it to haul his drums to gigs, which turned out to be a shrewd move. Bands wanted drummers who could show up with their own equipment and transportation, and Mick could offer both. He slept on his sister's floor in Notting Hill and started working his way into London's tight-knit music scene almost by sheer proximity. Things moved quickly from there. Within a year, a neighbor named Peter Barduns invited him to join his band, the Cheneys, and by 16, Mick was already opening for acts like the Rolling Stones. He later joined the Bow Street Runners, a group that had already scored a minor hit and a recording contract before he arrived. A factory strike sabotaged the pressing of their follow-up single, stalling the band's momentum. But for Mick it barely mattered. Every gig, every lineup change, every setback was another rung on a ladder he was climbing faster than most musicians twice his age. The real turning point came in 1967, when Mick auditioned for John Miles' Blues Breakers, one of the most respected outfits in the British blues revival. He was terrified walking into that audition, but he got the job, and it put him shoulder to shoulder with elite musicians, including a young bassist named John McVie. The two became close almost instantly. Unfortunately, Mick's drinking spiraled out of control during this period, and Miles eventually fired him for showing up intoxicated to shows. Even so, Mick has always described his time in that band as an unofficial education, a crash course in blues history taught by people who had lived it. That firing indirectly led to the moment that changed music history. Miles gave guitarist Peter Green some free studio time, and Green used it to record a handful of tracks with Mick and John McVie. One of those songs was a simple instrumental that Green, almost as a throwaway gesture, named after his two bandmates, Fleetwood Mac. A few months later, Green formed an actual band under that name, hoping the gesture would be enough to lure McVie away from the security of Miles' group. McVie initially declined, wary of giving up steady work, so Green filled in with a temporary bassist until McVie eventually changed his mind and joined for good. The band debuted in the summer of 1967 and released its first album the following February. It contained no major hit single, yet it still climbed to number 4 on the UK charts and stayed there for the better part of a year, propelled almost entirely by word of mouth and the group's ferocious live shows. It performed far more modestly in America, but the message was clear. This band didn't need a hit to build an audience. It needed to be heard live, and once people heard it, they came back. By the end of 1968, 2 new members had reshaped the group's sound entirely. 18-year-old guitarist Danny Kirwan joined after Green was blown away by his playing in a small local band, and Christine Perfect, already a respected vocalist and keyboardist in her own right, began contributing to sessions as a guest before eventually becoming a full member. With 3 guitarists trading leads, the band scored its first genuine international hit with an instrumental called Albatross, a song so different from their blues roots that it signaled the band was capable of far more than anyone had expected. Then came the moment that nearly ended everything before it truly began. In the spring of 1970, while touring Europe, Peter Green attended a gathering in Munich that has since become the stuff of rock legend. A commune, rumors of a cult, and an extremely potent dose of LSD that some believe was given to him without his full knowledge. Whatever happened that night, Green returned a changed man, increasingly preoccupied with the idea that money itself was corrupting, at one point wanting to give away the band's entire earnings. Within 2 months, he had left the group entirely, later receiving a diagnosis of schizophrenia and undergoing treatment that included electroconvulsive therapy. It was a devastating loss of one of the most gifted guitarists of his generation, and the band was left to figure out how to survive without him. Christine McVie, having married John McVie and briefly stepped away from music, rejoined just days before a scheduled American tour, filling the emotional and musical void Green's departure had created. Then, in early 1971, guitarist Jeremy Spencer vanished from a Los Angeles hotel under the pretense of buying a magazine and simply never returned. After days of searching, he was located, having joined a religious group known as the Children of God. When bandmates finally saw him again, his appearance and demeanor were almost unrecognizable. Guitarist Bob Welch was brought in to replace him, and the band pressed forward yet again, releasing records that traded their blues roots for a softer, more melodic sound that slowly built an American following even as it struggled commercially in Britain. The mid-1970s brought more turnover and more personal wreckage. Guitarist Bob Weston was dismissed after having an affair with Mick's wife at the time, Jenny Boyd, a betrayal that devastated Fleetwood even as his own struggles with cocaine were becoming more consuming. Bob Welch eventually quit as well, worn down by a tour plagued by half-empty venues and mounting internal tension. By the mid-1970s, the band that had once been anchored by Peter Green's guitar work barely resembled its original form. And yet, somehow, its most legendary chapter hadn't even started. That chapter began when Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joined as a package deal, a couple whose romantic and musical chemistry would define the band's next era. The self-titled 1975 album took the better part of a year to climb to #1. But once it did, it became a genuine phenomenon, eventually selling millions of copies. It was proof that this reshuffled lineup, against every prior indication, had found something extraordinary. But the same personal entanglements that had haunted the band from the beginning were about to reach a whole new level of intensity. By the time the band began recording what would become Rumours in 1976, nearly every member was going through a personal crisis simultaneously. Buckingham and Nicks had broken up, but were still forced into daily proximity in the studio. John and Christine McVie were divorcing after 8 years of marriage. Mick Fleetwood had just discovered his wife's affair, and he himself would soon begin a secret relationship with Stevie Nicks. Cocaine was everywhere. Arguments were constant. And yet when the tape started rolling, all of that pain somehow transformed into some of the most emotionally direct songwriting of the decade. Songs became coded messages between people who could no longer speak to each other honestly off the record. Rumours became one of the best-selling albums in history, eventually moving tens of millions of copies worldwide and winning the Grammy for Album of the Year. Its success created an almost impossible standard to follow, and the band's response was Tusk, an expensive, sprawling, deliberately experimental record that Buckingham pushed hard for, even as it strained the group's finances and patience. It never matched Rumours commercially, but it revealed a band still willing to take enormous creative risks rather than simply repeat a winning formula. The band found a more commercial footing again with Mirage in 1982, but by then the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Buckingham, feeling increasingly disconnected from the direction of the group, walked away after the tour and would not return for over a decade. Around this same period, Mick Fleetwood made what he has since called one of the worst financial decisions of his life, purchasing a massive farm property in Australia on borrowed money, only to abandon the lifestyle within weeks. Combined with the band's declining income, the debt from that purchase eventually forced him into bankruptcy in 1984, a stunning fall for a man who had helped generate one of the best-selling albums in music history. The band regrouped again for Tango and the Night in 1987, but just before the accompanying tour, Buckingham abruptly announced he was quitting during a tense meeting that reportedly turned physical between him and Stevie Nicks. With contracts already signed, the band brought in 2 replacement guitarists and carried on, even as fans made it clear with signs and chants that they hadn't fully accepted the new lineup. More changes followed through the early 1990s, including the band's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an honor that controversially excluded some members who had shaped its earliest sound, including Bob Welsh. The mid-1990s brought further instability, including a short-lived lineup that Fleetwood has since called one of his biggest regrets, and Christine McVie's decision to step away from full-time membership. But 1997 brought a genuine turning point. The classic Rumours-era lineup reunited for a live recording and television special that reintroduced the band to a new generation and reminded longtime fans exactly why the chemistry between these 5 people, however combustible, had never really disappeared. The resulting live album became one of the best-selling of its kind in American history. The band released what would become its final studio album, Say You Will, in 2003, years after Christine McVie's departure, though she still contributed to select tracks. It was a modest commercial success and marked the first extended collaboration between Buckingham and Nicks in the studio in 15 years. After that, Mick Fleetwood largely stepped back from the main Fleetwood Mac machine and returned to his musical origins, forming a blues-focused side project that earned a Grammy nomination and let him revisit the raw, unpolished sound that had first drawn him into music decades earlier. Fleetwood's life outside the band was, if anything, just as eventful. In a memoir published in 2014, he revealed the staggering scope of his cocaine addiction, estimating that it had cost him somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 million over the years. By the time he filed for bankruptcy in the 1980s, He was carrying debt worth more than 1.5 times his net worth and was, by his own account, barely able to function for a stretch of roughly 2 years. Rebuilding from that low point took time, but he eventually diversified into wine, photography, and restaurants, including a beloved venue in Maui that finally realized the childhood fantasy he had first built inside a barn. That restaurant was destroyed in the catastrophic wildfires that tore through Lahaina in August of 2023, one of the deadliest wildfire disasters in modern American history. Fleetwood was in Los Angeles when the fires broke out, but flew back immediately with supplies for his staff, many of whom had lost their own homes in the disaster. It was a gutting loss layered on top of everything else the town had endured, and it forced Fleetwood to confront, once again, how quickly something built over years could vanish in a single night. The following year brought a quieter, more reflective project, a collaborative album with ukulele virtuoso Jake Shimabukuro that included a tribute to Christine McVie, who had passed away in 2022. Fleetwood adjusted his usual percussive intensity to match the gentleness of the ukulele, and the resulting rendition of one of McVie's most beloved songs struck listeners as unusually tender for a drummer known for driving, forceful rhythms. It was, in many ways, Fleetwood using the only language he has ever fully trusted, rhythm, to say goodbye to someone he had spent half a century making music beside. His personal relationships followed a similarly turbulent arc to his professional ones. His first marriage, to Jenny Boyd, collapsed after her affair with a bandmate, though the two briefly remarried years later solely to help their daughters immigrate to the United States before divorcing again for good. Not long after, Fleetwood began his own complicated, drug-fueled affair with Stevie Nicks, one that both of them have since described as intense but ultimately doomed. When that relationship ended, Fleetwood moved in with one of Nicks's close friends, a betrayal significant enough that the woman was reportedly barred from the recording studio for a time. He would go on to marry twice more, first in a high-profile wedding attended by several major music figures, and later in a marriage that lasted nearly 2 decades and produced twin daughters before ending in divorce in his late 60s.